Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this panel on reviving democracy. Um, I am the France correspondent for Politico, and I am joined by a wonderful panel with whom we are going to discuss the challenges to democracy and what our countries are going through right now. As you know, trust in government is declining. There's a growing sentiment of that the system is not working for a lot of people in society. Societies are being confronted to globalization, extremely fast-paced technological change, growing inequalities, migration flows, and all of that is being harnessed by populist leaders. So we are going to try to delve into the various facets of these challenges. Allow me to introduce our panelists very quickly. So in the middle, in red, Heather Graby, who is the director of the Open Society European Policy Institute. Next to her on the right, Peter McLeod, that's right? Principal and founder of Mass LBD from Canada, Susanna Stanova, who is the CSR head at, I'm going to try to say this correctly, it's Cvernovka, right? Foundation in Slovakia. And then at the very end over there, Matthew Taylor, who's a chief executive of the Royal Society of Arts in the UK. Before I hand over the floor to our panelists, we have a system here called Bcast, and we'd like to ask you a first question that is a poll. It's a yes or no question, and you can answer it through your app. So the question goes, do you think that social polarization is a threat to democracy? And now I'm going to hand over the floor to Heather Graby to start us off. Thank you.
Well, none of you have answered yet, but the obvious answer is yes, it's a threat to democracy. The real question is what to do about it. Now, polarization is a normal feature of, oh, there we go. Yeah, you see, we don't even need to deliberate this. It's so obvious. But the question is how do you overcome it? Because it's clearly increasing, and populism has divided societies more and more into hostile tribes, because that's how populism works. And it's obviously something that increases over time when societies become more diverse, when they come under pressure, and when they lose a sense of the things that bind them, the sense of the common ground. And that seems to be happening more and more. So the question is what to do about it. And we have on this panel some people who have very great experience in bringing communities back together around rather complex policy issues in the shape of Peter, as well as exploring everything from, I think the RSA has worked on the spiritual dimension of society and how it can bring people together. And Slovakia has, of course, just come back together as a society in a rather spectacular way with the last presidential election. So we can see the ups and downs of politics happen. But I think the big question is, how does a democracy which is based on representation in still quite 19th century technology of voting every 5 years, you get your little pencil and you do a little cross every 5 years, is that really going to work for renegotiation of social contracts in an age of massive disruption as technological change comes together with climate change and the limits of sustainability of our current economic system, plus aging populations? If populism has had a heyday because of migration and globalization, we haven't seen anything yet. It's going to get a lot worse. So how do we actually try to bring societies back together in order to make these big transitions, renegotiate really the relationship between citizen and the state? And the answer is, of course, to focus on who lies between citizen and state. What's that median level of politics, which goes beyond the just voting every 5 years? And you can think of that in many different ways. Civil society, civic engagement, just many ways that people can affiliate, come together, debate politically, and have a diversity of views which doesn't divide them. Instead, it leads to a really healthy debate that leads to a consensual outcome. Now, I would argue that you need to look quite carefully at what function you want these different forms of engagement beyond elections to take. And it's easy to say, yes, we need more civic engagement. The question is, how do you do it? And I would just point to 4 key functions that civic engagement needs to, there are really 4 gaps that representative democracy, as it's currently conceived, has, which civic engagement needs to fill. And I'm not sure it can do it, actually, but it's very important that we now invest in new methods of doing it. So one of them is to give people a sense of personal engagement, of agency and voice, of the kind that they experience online as consumers, but they tend not to experience offline as voters. So the sense of being heard, the sense of having their own engagement with the democratic process. And how do you do that at scale? And I think Peter will talk about that as well, because the scale question is actually quite difficult. Amazon can give you a sense that you're reaching millions of people with your critique of a faulty kettle. Maybe only 3 people read it, but you have the sense you're talking to millions. So how do you do that at scale for voters, that they feel they can engage with millions as well? So there you need multiple methods of civil society engagement, I would argue. You need very diverse fora, from local level discussions about how to repair potholes in the road, to international discussions about the trade-offs to make in terms of moving towards a sustainable economy. The second gap is ensuring that citizens have a real understanding of the consequences of the choices that they think they're making, and between the different trade-offs they are offered. Now, in the country I know best, we've just had a spectacular example of how not to do it. That if people lack information, real information, like serious analysis and the kind of thing the Bank of England might produce, for example, and they're instead told lies, then they may make a choice where they don't really know the consequences. They might also not have the kind of deliberation which would make them understand the trade-offs between their interests and those of others. And that's also something it's very easy to misrepresent if you don't have a focused, deliberative process. So I think deliberative processes are really critical in bringing the information and the deliberation, the understanding of trade-offs and really of long-term consequences for yourself and your community in order to get a good result. Thirdly, they need to give a sense of community and of a common future. Now, this is the trickiest part of all, because when you have a globalized economy and a huge degree of interdependence, no one country on its own can renegotiate the social contract alone, because it has externalities. People move, capital moves, obviously, waste moves. Even one country trying to do climate transition and moving to a low carbon economy, that doesn't work on its own, because it ends up exporting its waste to the poorer country further south, which then dumps it in the sea and it lands back on the beaches. That is literally what is happening between the global north and the global south right now. So a climate transition, a sustainable transition, has to involve the trade-offs and a deliberative process which is international, which is intercontinental. Now that's a real scale issue. That's beyond national. That's not even something we can do in Europe through the European Union. The EU is an important part of it, but it's something where we don't even begin to have a deliberative mechanism internationally. So how do we deal with that? And finally, how can a deliberative mechanism, how can civic engagement bring in the stakeholders who will really be affected by the choices we make right now? Now, you can't bring them into the room. You can't involve them in any process because they aren't born yet. How do you involve the stakeholders of the future, our grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and so on, who not only are going to suffer the burden of the fact that we are delaying so long in starting to make these transitions, but they don't really have any say at all in where they will be born into a society. That's just really not their choice. They will find that people have made decisions before them. And will their interests really have been taken into account? Who's going to give them voice? Now, that's a real challenge, because a deliberative process, even if it involves a great representative sample of society, how does it involve also the society that's yet to come? I don't have an answer on that, but I would suggest it's a really good question.
Thank you for that. I'm just going to ask you one question. Listening to you, it just seems like our current democracy as we know it, and as we've known it, I think as long as everyone has been alive in this room, just isn't prepared, just isn't equipped for these massive challenges that we are facing. So what do we do? Do we just throw it out the window? Is there a better system out there that you're seeing, or are we just all coming back to the drawing board?
Well, societies have faced this kind of scale of challenge before. The Industrial Revolution, Gutenberg's Bible, even the end of feudalism. The thing is, in the past, we didn't have YouTube, and we didn't have protest parties. You know, solutions were imposed, and there was actually a great deal of social pain and suffering, and it tended to fall on the poorest and most vulnerable in those societies. And those who had the means to protect themselves and buffer the transition, they used those means to do so. Now, these days, we have higher aspirations. We like to think that it's possible to have a just transition, and I would argue, in a democracy, you have to have a just transition, because if the transition is not just, it simply won't happen at all. You just have constant gilets jaunes. So the way to think about that is...
I mean, they've been in the streets for 6 months. That is something France is now facing.
So let's learn the lessons of that. So first of all, don't do it piecemeal, I would argue. Don't start just with one measure or two measures. Start with, this is the plan, this is the vision, this is where we're going. Secondly, involve the people in the decision about that vision, rather than just kind of setting it out à la Jupiter. And thirdly, I would argue, don't start with tractor fuel, start with corporate jets. You know, make sure it's very clear that the cost of the transition, the burden is not all going to fall on those who can least afford to pay. Start with make the polluter pay, and also make sure that it's very clear that the costs will be distributed across society. They won't all fall on households, they won't all fall on rural areas.
All right, thank you, Heather. I'm going to move on to Peter here, give you the floor, and we'll continue this conversation.
All right. Well, it's a delight to be able to bring a Canadian perspective to today's discussions. There are three points that I really wanted to hit on. One, what it is we might be taking away from what increasingly feels like a deliberative moment, because, of course, so many jurisdictions are turning to citizens' assemblies and citizen juries and other mechanisms to try and respond to some of the challenges that my colleague here has so ably described. The second thing I'd like to talk about are some of the conceptual tensions, however, in deliberative democracy that are often sort of papered over, and that I think we need to be very careful about if any of these processes are ultimately going to have the sort of traction that we hope for. And the third point I want to make is kind of what comes along with a commitment to this deliberative agenda, because I think we're only halfway there. So let's just start with some good news, right? Because it sure seems a little gray right now. But, you know, if you follow what's happening, it seems like you can't go by a couple of days without another jurisdiction announcing that there will be a citizens' assembly on climate change, as there is here in France, that there's going to be one in Wales on the future of their society, that there'll be one in Scotland to anticipate the next referendum. There'll be a climate change assembly in Toronto. There's one on transportation infrastructure in Montreal. And we've seen suddenly this fluorescence of activity where we are looking to create meaningful ways for citizens not to be consulted in that stereotypical way where there might be a microphone at the back of the room and we patiently ask everyone to stand up and say their piece, but where we're actually creating more seats at more tables for citizens to really do some of the work of policy making and critically be creating consensus and legitimacy for tough choices. Now, it's an open question as to whether some of it can scale to the sorts of challenges presented by issues like Brexit, but nevertheless, we're starting to develop some new repertoires that I think can be very helpful in augmenting and bolstering, and I choose those words carefully. I don't mean supplanting, but augmenting and bolstering our existing architecture of representative democracy. Part and parcel of this is that we are rediscovering the capacity of the citizen to play a more informed and constructive role. After all, we have either accidentally, perhaps deliberately, been complacent with a story of citizens as being this kind of apathetic and disinterested force in society. And to me, any story about citizen apathy is really about blaming the victim, especially one in which greater social and polarization, economic polarization exists. So we have some green shoots here that are starting to break through, and we can talk about what they need in order to be supported. In Canada, at least, we've set a course to try and make this simply part of our political culture. The idea being that just as though every citizen might once in their lifetime receive a summons from a court to serve on a jury And in all likelihood, they won't actually be selected as one of the 12, but it will just be part of our political culture. It will be a social convention. So too should every citizen, once or twice in their lifetime, get a letter inviting them to volunteer to serve on a policy process of some consequence for their society. At this point, we have already sent a letter to 1 in 65 households in Canada. 300,000 Canadians have been invited to serve on more than 40 different major deliberative exercises that have taken place over the course of the past 15 years. What that gets us to is about 50,000 hours of citizen volunteer time from all walks of life in all parts of our country being invested in dealing with some of the most complex issues. And I think what this demonstrates is the versatility, the durability of this approach, and that right now we're moving from a period of innovation actually into norm setting. So let me just talk briefly about some of the conceptual tensions that I see. Critically, I think we need to differentiate between whether fundamentally we have a view of democracy as an aggregative process where we come together with our individual interests and it's a majoritarian winner-take-all exercise, or whether we see democracy fundamentally as an empathetic way of organizing our social relations. And what I mean by invoking empathy is that democracy then has to be something where we challenge ourselves, in Michael Ignatieff's great phrase, to really understand the needs of strangers. That we have to do, most basically, is to try and put ourselves in one another's shoes. Now, this plays against the sort of trend around interest-based politics, but also identity-based politics. What we need to do is, I would argue, extend the privilege of representation to a far wider swath of society, not asking them to come and tell us what they think and tell us what they want, but because we understand politics and democratic politics as a learning politics to try and understand the needs of others. And that's what a good deliberative process is fundamentally all about. But it can't be allowed to undermine that architecture of representation. Basically, we can't get everybody in the same Congress hall. We do need to delegate our voice to others, and we need to cultivate the skills of citizenship so that we can do that effectively and responsively. This is going to be a long process. It has taken us the better part of 120 years simply to lock in universal suffrage. And right now we're only at, 18 and up, right? And many reforms, even in Canada, continued into the 1990s, expanding the franchise. I like to think of that as D1. That's the first half of the democratic project. D2 is the second half. In D1, we decided that everyone should have the vote. We haven't decided what ratio in a democratic society, what ratio of citizens ought to have the occasion to perform some kind of formal or informal role as a citizen representative. Is it 1%? Is it less than 1%? Is it 10 or 20%? This is not the case that everyone needs to be engaged in policy making every Wednesday evening for the rest of their natural lives. What we do know is that people are prepared to engage episodically and intensively and bring a variety of motivations to that discussion. The point that I want to end on, however, is where we go next. If the work is about extending the privilege of representation and creating other opportunities for people to serve, we can't fail to scale some of the dynamics that are present in good deliberative processes. I like to say that public engagement and public learning are flip sides of the same coin. There was perhaps an original we went down a very challenging road about 100 years ago with the birth of the public opinion research industry. We decided at that time that we were more interested in what people like and what people want, and not at all interested in what they know and don't know. Consequently, and I'm kind of making up this number, but I'd love to see a graph right now. You'll see I'll tie this together in a second. I'd love to see a graph of the number of practicing journalists. I know in Canada that line has been decreasing. Simultaneously, the number of people employed in public sector communications has been certainly increasing. The challenge, though, if we need to reinvent public consultation, we have to reinvent public sector communications as well, because the focus of that profession has been reputation management and risk management. We always act surprised when we hear the apocryphal story that after the Brexit referendum, the top Google search was, what is Brexit or what is EU? Or when we ask people how much do they think their country spends on foreign aid, they say 20%, right? We don't actually take seriously the knowledge deficits. This is different than saying people are dumb or people are stupid. We have best educated public ever. But the things people focus on may be very different than the things that you and I focus on in this room. And we need to get clear as a broader public sector about the things we think people ought to know. And we need to kind of re-engage in a process of adult education, not in a way that is patronizing, but in a way that is actually enlivening and equipping people with the information they need and the heuristics they require to make good choices and navigate life more effectively. I think if we spent half the energy we do on understanding public knowledge as opposed to public opinion, we would be far and away better equipped to deal with some of the challenges we see now.
Thank you for that, Peter. And allow me here to ask you a question as a journalist who is faced with this question every day. Before I was at Politico, I worked for an American television network, and I can tell you that this question about what do we put on the evening news was a lightning rod every night. And one cannot deny the pressure of ratings. These are businesses. And saying, oh, this is important, you need to watch this piece of news because it's important, because you need to learn this piece of information, does not work. And we are now faced with a paradox, which is never has information been this accessible, and never has the public been this lacking in the information it needs. How do we counter that, taking into consideration the business pressures that the media, journalists are confronted with?
I really don't know whether people are actually more ignorant today than they have been at other periods in history. Maybe some friends from the Pew Center could tell us this, but certainly we can't make essential public information just be muesli and granola that people have to somehow scarf down. Exactly. That said, we know that great communicators make important information appealing and interesting. An American example, Bill Nye the Science Guy, beloved by a generation of kids, many of whom will never go on to careers in science, right? And Hans Rosling, of course, the work that he's done with Gapminder, another great example. Sorry to point to this, but here's further reason why we need to invest in our public broadcasters, right? And why we also do need, as we're beginning to in Canada, to subsidize even private journalism to ensure that there is strong independent journalism in our country. But before we get to the, how do we program the evening news, we just need to start with the assumptions that I think are most detrimental. And one of them has been this really nasty virus, which I hear constantly from very well-intentioned public sector communications professionals who say, well, the public doesn't read, and we have to write it in a grade 4, grade 5 level. The reality is people are reading constantly. Most things on their phones, it's text. Even if you take the trashiest tabloid, it's still text. People are reading lots and lots of stuff. What we have to do is figure out in a very clear-eyed way with the public what it is we believe it's essential for people to know. A transit agency ought to have an idea of like the 20 or 50 things people ought to know about public transportation. A utility, the 10 or 20 things people ought to know about energy. A health organization, maybe the 50 or 100 things we ought to know at different phases of our life, and direct the full force of, the hundreds of millions of dollars being spent on communications to seeing that we have a public that is well informed and well equipped, and far less energy spent on the kind of reputational management that we see today.
I mean, not to belabor this, but isn't the public telling us what it wants to read with the number of clicks certain articles get? And the numbers are very clear. An article on the latest phase of the war in Syria gets 1/100th of the clicks that an article on a grumpy cat dying gets. That is just the reality.
You know, one example I'll point to in Canada is that our MPs have franking privileges. They get to send free post to their constituents, and they get to send, I think it's twice a year, these householders, which are broadsheet newspapers, and genuinely, whether left or right, they produce these things as though their constituents are stupid, right? And that they can't find anything of interest to say about what they've done and what they've learned over the course of the past 4 to 6 months in Parliament. Yes, social media is compelling and delicious, and we need a balanced media diet, and we will continue to consume all the cat videos, you know, YouTube can throw at us, I'm sure. But we're also, in so many important ways, not even showing up with the communications resources that exist. And so I'm not saying wholesale culture change here. I'm just saying, you know, in the same way that we've begun to question some of the fundamentals of public engagement and realize that the traditional mechanisms don't work, we need to be much more sophisticated about public sector communications and have as our motivation and responsibility the idea of raising public knowledge, because we can measure that. If we set a baseline, then we can hold our kind of public sector communications chiefs accountable that over 2 or 3 years, whatever they've tried hasn't worked, so they should try something else. But we hold it as essential that the public is well informed, and we can point to some of the work Finland is doing around you know, disinformation and the different materials they put out, the different kinds of public meetings they've held as an instance where you can actually get mass appeal and mass take-up.
I'm just going to check in with this poll that we have. So we're halfway through our panel, and as you can see, it's almost half-half, even though it started, we had, what, 100% yes the first couple of minutes. We're now down to 59% yes. 59% think that social polarization is a threat to democracy.
Another illustration of why voting as a democratic mechanism is just so polarizing in and of itself.
Especially with only 41 participants.
I'm going to pass the floor, please, to Susanna now.
Good afternoon. So Heather and Peter have been addressing the topic a little bit, in my opinion, from an overall perspective. My experience, my story is a little bit more local, a little bit more specific. So I'll start from that, and from there to the broader perspective again. I represent here the Cvernovka Thread Factory Foundation, which is a creative and cultural center in Bratislava, and it is the largest creative and cultural center, grassroots, bottom-up built, without basically any help of structural funds or any such substantial funding, built into the largest creative center in the country of 17,000 square meters floor area in just a couple of months. And but in that short life of, let's say, 3 years that we have been in this location, in the current location, many important events took place in our country. I'm sure some of you have followed it. And I'm glad that we can say that we have played an important part in this process, and in the process of reviving democracy, if I may say, and rebuilding restoration of trust. And we'll talk about that later more into detail. But I'll just describe in a few words what we went through. After the tragic events of last year, when the journalist Jan Kuciak was murdered alongside with his fiancée, the events took such turn that we felt that we can no longer serve in this situation only as a creative center, even if it is a home of hundreds of excellent architects, designers, artists, representatives of non-governmental organizations helping the homeless people, abandoned animals, climate change, in the climate change mitigation, and so on. We felt that the society needs us, that the country needs us, and So what we did, and I'm glad to say so, is that we were part of the movement of the independent cultural centers, part of a joint action where we expressed the need very strongly for an open, democratic, fair debate about many issues, many important issues relating to the state of democracy in our country. And secondly, we were able to create and introduce a space in the society where this debate could begin. I'm glad to say, in many ways, that the situation in our country nowadays, the overall mood, in many ways, is much less dark than we felt it last year, and it is thanks to all the people, the dozens of thousands of people that went in the streets, and the one thing that describes them and that we find very important in this dialogue, and this is also how we held this dialogue together with all the other organizations, was that it was peaceful. There were really up to 100,000 people very close to my home, and they were in the streets in almost every city in the country, demanding this kind of, calling for this kind of discussion. There were really huge crowds in the streets every week, but they were still peaceful. No one was hurt, there were no injuries, no property was damaged, there was no waste in the streets afterwards. It was very peaceful, calm, and constructive. And therefore, I would like to say that I would be glad if this would serve as an example for anyone who would feel the need for such an action in their country. Please do it peacefully. I think that our example throughout our history serves as a good example that positive changes in the society and reviving democracy in the society can be done without any violence. I think this is a very important message that I want to bring here.
Zuzana, if I may. Thank you for your very poignant testimony. Do you know why the movement in your country was able to remain so peaceful and effective when we see, for example, in France, the Gilets jaunes movement has completely gotten out of hand? What do you think helped the movement in your country?
There are two elements in this, I think. One is the element of cooperation, and the other one is the element of trust. When I'm speaking about cooperation, I mean a common goal of the people, of the institutions, even the governmental bodies, public bodies. That's at least the goal. That's what we're aiming at. That this dialogue should take place. It should be more and more effective. There is really a lot of stake here, but it was great to observe how the people, how the citizens could cooperate on such a larger scale, and I think this is it's hardly anything to say. If I should really find one word to describe why it was peaceful, besides of the character of our history, where every time we fought for something it was peaceful, like the Velvet Revolution, and there are several other examples. Actually, I don't recall that we ever achieved some societal change involving any violence. That is the answer to those, to that part of our citizens and our political representation, sadly, who think that this should be done the other way. And I'm talking to them now also.
So when you say that people cooperated, can you tell us in what spaces were they cooperating? Were they coming together physically and discussing their common goal? Were they doing it online? Were there private chat groups on WhatsApp? How did that happen?
I think it was all of that, but probably, well, most likely it started with the movement of the young people, that they were able to bring together this enormous number of people, of supporters. And you know, I mean, when you create an event on a social media, even if it's allegedly it will be attended by a large number of attendants, regardless what event you created, the real number is unlikely to be equal to that was reached on social media. So in the beginning, it was everyone was kind of doubtful of how many people will actually show up, and I think that when the people saw that actually the crowd that really showed up at the squares, it was a strong moment for them that not only all the others felt the same way, felt that they need to contribute to the improvement of the democracy in the country and the processes in the country. Not only they saw that it was also their neighbors and friends, and they really let's say didn't I failed to find a word. They didn't prefer their own program for whatever reason, but they really took this. It was so important for them that every week they showed up at the square, or every second week. And this created this common spirit that created, I think, the very base of the good cooperation of the public that we were observing during this time period.
Thank you very much, Susanna. I'm going to pass the floor to Matthew to close us off with our opening remarks.
Well, thank you. I'm going to be really brief. The first point I want to make is that reform of our democratic institutions is part of a system reset. And it won't solve anything without being part of that broader system reset. So if you try to reform democracy without reforming elements of capitalism, without addressing a wider set of kind of structural questions, then its chances of success are smaller. So I think democratic reform is absolutely a central part of broader system reform, but it needs to be understood in the context of broader system reform. I think secondly, as other speakers have already implied, that we just have to recognize that representative democracy is necessary, but it is not sufficient. And as long as we carry on thinking that representative democracy is a sufficient basis for legitimacy, then democracy's fortunes will continue to ebb. And we should be worried because the support that the public expresses for democracy around the world is declining, and the willingness of the public to countenance alternative forms of kind of strongman leadership are rising. And also, despite the heroic example of Slovakia, that the problem is that you can have popular representative democracy, but it can lose its popularity very quickly. But once you elect people who don't really have a commitment to constitutional democracy, it's quite hard to wrestle back those systems. So that's why it can feel like a kind of one-way street. The third point is that deliberation, I think, forms of deliberative democracy are the most fruitful route for us to take, the most fruitful way for us to enhance representative democracy. They're not the only way of doing it. Sometimes, in certain circumstances, direct democracy has a role. Other forms of participation and engagement also have a role as part of a broader ecology. But for reasons that Peter's kind of described, deliberation, it seems to me, is the most relevant way of addressing the problems of representative democracy, simply because it brings ordinary citizens to the process in a way that deals with issues to do with the lack of mandate for representatives, and also the sense that representatives are not really representative, because the second they become politicians, and this isn't to denigrate politicians, but they cease to be ordinary citizens. So I think deliberation is the most fruitful route for reform. The fourth point is that technique matters. This is a challenge because for people like Peter and other practitioners, it means that they have to get involved in detail, which is a bit boring to 95% of the population. But if you don't do public engagement right, it's actually worse than not doing it at all. So the form that you use, the way that you do it, that you resource it properly, it's facilitated well, all those kind of things really do matter. And this shouldn't surprise us, because when it comes to our representative systems, we understand that the way in which constitutions have been crafted and evolved is an important part of those democracies working. So deliberation does involve a set of kind of technical challenges to get it right. If it's done in a sloppy way, then the outcomes won't be great. And then the final point I want to make is, well, what are the barriers to this? Because as Peter said, deliberation is taking place all around the world in a whole variety of forms, and what is really noticeable about it is overwhelmingly positive. Not only for the people who participate, but for the agencies who commission it, and in relation to public opinion more generally. So if this works, and representative democracy so badly needs to be enhanced, and by the way, let me be absolutely clear, I see deliberation as a way of enhancing representative democracy and making it work better, not as an alternative to or a replacement for representative democracy. Then why isn't it spreading? And I think that there are probably three reasons why it's not spreading. The first is the vanity of politicians, who deep down don't think the public are capable of judgment. And that's just an argument we have to fight and win. Secondly, media indifference. The media finds this stuff a bit dull. And also I think that journalists, and just like politicians, many of my best friends are journalists, but I think that journalists have a predisposition to think that the public isn't capable of dealing with complex issues, because that's why we need journalists. And so the idea that a group of ordinary citizens are perfectly capable over a couple of days of getting their head around complex issues, having sophisticated conversations and reaching intelligent conclusions is somewhat threatening to people who see themselves as the kind of gatekeepers of the truth. So I just find deliberative democracy is just systematically underreported by journalists. I can see their eyes glazing over when I talk about it. And it's partly because what I don't want to say journalists, but what people who organise political shows on TV want is they want adversarialism. They want drama. And deliberation is rather beautiful, as people sit and they talk and they listen to each other and they learn and they change their views, but it isn't dramatic, and it's, people don't fight and stuff like that. So, and then the third issue is actually ignorance. And this is important because, in my experience, very few people are opposed to deliberation. In fact, I don't think I've really met anybody who's opposed to deliberation. I've heard people who are kind of apathetic about it or worried about it, but not really opposed to it. And a lot of democratic reforms people are opposed to. So in the UK, people argue for proportional representation. Lots of people are opposed to that, and they're not going to change their view. People argue for House of Lords reform. Lots of people are opposed to that, reducing votes to 16. There's all sorts of democratic reforms. But people are not opposed to deliberation. They just don't understand it. And I talk to really senior politicians, and they don't know what it is. I mean, it's kind of slightly bizarre, slightly frightening. So my solution to all of that is we just have to do it. We have to do it and keep doing it until people know what it is, they recognize it, they understand it, they see that it works, and then I don't think people will look back. And so the true pioneers are people like Peter who are just doing this stuff, and there are a lot of you, and there are more and more of you around the world, and we need to support them, because until people have seen it, and once people have seen it, once people know what it is, then they're converts, but it's very difficult to do without them actually seeing it happening in practice.
So let me ask you this. How do you square that desire for more deliberation with also statistics that we're seeing of more and more people in democracies not being against a military man taking over, or thinking that a strong man might be better than the current system. We see it in France, for example, but not just here. You know, we've seen strongmen populists get to power in a few countries in Europe where democracy was supposed to be well established. How do you square those two?
So it's a complex question, but I'll tell you what my theory is about that. It is that we have abandoned the fundamental task of politics and education, which is to, well, no, I don't think we've abandoned it. I think we've stopped progressing the task, which is to get people to live with complexity and understand complexity. And so our conventional politicians, our mainstream politicians, have told us at every election, the only reason the world is a mess is because of that guy. And if you elect me, everything will be fine. And if you tell people that, and then they see over and over and over again it isn't true, what you do is you create a politics which is suited to people who can say that with absolutely no shame and total conviction. And that's populists. And the great thing about deliberation is it introduces people to complexity, and it demonstrates that people can cope with complexity. The point of deliberation nearly always is to get people to understand trade-offs and make difficult choices. So in a sense, sorry to use a kind of soccer metaphor here, but our mainstream politicians who should have known better have been playing a long ball game, you know, rather than playing a attractive passing game that, you know, has got artistry and creativity to it. They've been hoofing the ball up and flying in with two-footed tackles. And the problem is they should have seen that on the practice pitch, there was a team of people who were kind of 8 foot tall and didn't mind punching people in the face. And therefore, if you played that kind of football, you were going to lose to these people who are going to be totally ruthless about it. So we have to return democracy to being a beautiful game.
Thank you all. I just want to start with one question to all of you. Because we are in France, I want to ask each one of you to assess what has been called the Grand Débat here. Because it's touted by the French government as an unprecedented exercise in democracy, but it's also been attacked by detractors of the president who say that he used it to campaign. The Gilets jaunes weren't happy with it because they felt that it was rigged and the questions were all prepared in advance somehow. So what is your assessment, each one of you? Go for it.
I would just refer you to what I said earlier, which is you have to get the technique of these things right. And, you know, in many ways it was a bold experiment. And from what I hear at the actual events were great, but people's perception of it is problematic. And I think that's partly because if you only look as though you're doing it as a response, it suggests a lack of authenticity. It suggests that you just want to get things back to normal and then you can reassert a more traditional way of doing things. And then secondly, if the technique is not right, then people will have all these kind of suspicions, which is why I go back to what I said earlier. You just have to do it and do it right. And then, you know, when I talk to people about deliberation, they say, well, how can you genuinely have all sides of the argument represented? How can you get people to disagree to talk to each other? How can you resolve these things? And, you know, you can spend a lot of time explaining it, or else you can say, well, look here. Here's a group of people, they were represented the population, they had different views, and they were expert facilitators, they were sampled properly, they were given the material, and at the end of the 2 days, they had come up with a sensible view. Many of them had changed their mind, and everyone said, I really quite enjoyed that, when can I do it again?
Anyone else wants to take a stab?
Well, maybe building on Matthew's point, I'm not familiar with all the intricacies of the Grand Débat here, but I think this point about craft work is really important, that getting the details right matters. And, you know, I think we should all beware of the hyperbole that is also infiltrating this space. Anything that smacks of democratic solutionism kind of makes me recoil a bit. And so if we just in kind of broad strokes say there will be 200 citizens and they will deliberate for 9 months or whatever it might be, we need to really understand, well, what are you trying to achieve? And I think there's some art and there's some craft to the design and execution of these processes, and really it is just too susceptible to kind of clever people who want to say, well, we're going to set up a new sortition-based chamber, or we're going to bolt this on in all kinds of ways. And We have yet to see any major failures, but inevitably that's going to be part of the normalization process as well. I think, those people who are following the field closely, it's helpful to differentiate between what may be three distinct avenues in which deliberative democracy is being employed. One is institutional, that is helping kind of broader public sector organizations deal with complex but largely workaday matters of the allocation of resources and prioritization in health and education and land use and transportation and whatnot. Then you've got a kind of legislative track where you do see initiatives that are trying to support the work of municipalities, like in Madrid, where they're working with councils, parliaments, legislatures. But then we see this other class, and this is where I think some of the risks really begin to present themselves, and that's dealing with the kind of quasi-constitutional matters where they're being set over and above all existing political processes. And whether they can carry the weight and whether they can be done with the kinds of skills and resources that Matthew is invoking, I think remains to be seen. I'm hopeful, but that's a big challenge.
I think also there's a critical point you made earlier, Peter, which is to make it part of the political culture of the country. If it's seen as a one-off initiative of one political leader who's in a spot of bother, it's not going to have the kind of input legitimacy that it needs to be accepted as something that is non-partisan and is really to benefit the whole country and its future. It also needs to have output legitimacy. Any democratic process needs to have both the input and the output legitimacy. In the end, what difference is it going to make? Is it towards a particular decision? Is it going to be, what's the articulation between that process and what's going on in the Assemblée Nationale? That's the kind of constitutional status of it also needs to be resolved. And so perhaps the thing to do is also look, I think Matthew's absolutely right, looking at examples is really helpful rather than just talking in the abstract, because a number of countries have experimented with several different ways of doing this. There's Canada, there's New Zealand. Ireland is really interesting. I mean, there was the way a consensus was built across the country with a really well-informed public debate about the repeal of Article 8 of the Constitution on abortion. That method has also been used, it hasn't been so much reported in the press outside Ireland, on other matters, including climate, which involves incredibly complex trade-offs and all of the other tricky things about the intergenerational justice and intercontinental justice and so on. And so I think Ireland is very interesting because their citizens have a sense that this is a normal part of democracy. It's not just your duty to take part, but you're going to get something out of it because this is where you have your say. This is where you have your opportunity to be part of the debate. And then it's not at the whim of a president. It's very much part of the political culture. And then that also means that there's no suggestion that it would supplant representative democracy. It's very much a supplement to it.
Well, in answer to your question, I'll refer to my previous experience from local government in Bratislava. Again, the local scale, but I think it's very useful in this regard. The implementation of any policy, any measure, even implementation of a project that is very physical, such as a new park or a new kindergarten or a new school or anything that's really visible, tangible to the citizens, can be violently opposed by the citizens if it is not really thoroughly communicated before. My only answer to this would be participation, participation, participation. And it's very good to have it's very useful to have a body inside the organization or a department that is dealing with participation and communication in a new modern way, meaning communication not as a communication towards the media, when something's happening or has happened, but much prior to the decision being made, and involving the people as much as it was said before. I completely agree with that. Involving the people as much as possible to the decision making, but really much prior to, I'd say, together with the initial idea, maybe.
Matthew, you had a point?
I just want to make one point, which is that I think there are two communities talking about different elements of reform. And Susanna's point kind of reminded me of this, which is there's a group of people who talk about democratic reform, and there's a group of people who talk about governmental reform. So there's a kind of GovTech conversation, and there's a kind of democratic reform conversation. And actually, in my experience, these two communities don't really mix. So the democratic people are kind of a bit more kind of earthy and community focused and political and kind of quite like stuff being messy. And the GovTech people are a bit more kind of techie and geeky and like things to be neat and smart. And yet, these two communities have to work together, because if you reform your democracy but your government is incompetent, bureaucratic, slow, unresponsive, you're just going to annoy people even more. And similarly, if you make your government shiny and effective and responsive, but your politicians are kind of corrupt and venal and not listening, then that's not going to work either. So we have a bit of a flaw in our system at the moment, which is that two groups of people really need to be thinking about solutions for places which combine democratic reform and revival with more effective forms of governance and policy making and service provision. So we need to get these communities together.
Heather?
I think there's a critical issue here that you're getting to, Matthew, with that we haven't talked about in terms of restoring the restoration of trust, which you started with, Rim, which is the issue of competence of governments. One of the most damaging things for democracy over the past 10 years of crisis in Europe has been the growing perception that governments are not competent. They actually can't take action that's effective. They can't deal with an economic crisis and then a migration crisis and now a values crisis. And this is not just at EU level, it's also at national level. And citizens are quite rightly perceiving that national governments in particular have lost a lot of the power that they used to have. Their hands are tied on economic policy because we live in a globalized world. We've got a common currency in the European Union, but even those outside the common currency can't just do whatever they want to with their currency because it will have a dramatic impact on the real economy. So the fiscal side is more constrained, the monetary side is more constrained, but also we're more constrained simply because we're living in a system, in a very complex world where what happens in one country dramatically affects the country next door. And so for that reason, you can't, you never could have maybe socialism in one country. You can't also, I would argue, have democratic transition and definitely not economic and climate-based transition in one country either, because it's going to affect everybody around you. And so how do you deal with that when representative democracy is basically to elect politicians at national level? Now, so the national level, it's only got limited powers these days. And so I can see why voters are frustrated about this. Now, one answer is, okay, in Europe, we've got the European Parliament, it's directly elected, that's all great. But the EU also has limited powers in various ways. So this dispersal, this diffusion of power is quite hard to understand. And I would argue that deliberative mechanisms have an important role to play here. That when people feel like they are themselves personally engaged in at least one level of decision making, it's easier to understand the other levels of decision making and to see how they fit together. And it allows, even if it's not everybody in the population, 1 in 65 households, that's already pretty high actually in Canada. I mean, it would be amazing to get that among 500 million people in Europe. But already you have a sense that, okay, it's a complex system, but we can cope with that complexity because there are many different ways of inputting to it. And it's possible to understand it. So education is critical to understanding it, but also a sense that it's possible to do something about it. The sense of frustration with government also comes because people are deeply frustrated about their own helplessness at dealing with this situation. And when politicians say, well, look, there's nothing I can do, it's the markets, it's the EU, let's blame somebody else, that just increases the sense of their own helplessness. And the only way out of that is to empower people in local communities, engage them directly, and even if it's not absolutely everybody, if you know that somebody on your street has been involved with it, you've learned about it at school, you have a sense that it's happening in your country, that's going to give you a much greater sense of personal engagement.
How do you reach those people who are overwhelmed by this globalization? Twice, Heather, you pointed to the fact that many of the challenges that we are facing as societies go beyond national borders. But it is specifically that point that is being used by populists and benefiting populists. And we've seen the return of certain populists, and might I add, not just populists. I think that's a nice word when we're describing far-right, extreme-right movements in places like Germany, in places like Austria, and in other places. So how do we avoid that? How do we bring those people who think actually the response is to close down borders and to blame those who have a different color skin or believe in a different religion, and tell them actually no, the response is to come together in a space, have deliberation, and find common ground?
You have to bust the myth of the simple answer. You have to bust the fundamental populist claim, which is vote for me as the strongman leader, and I will stop the world, and we can all get off. And the only way you can do that is by people actually understanding with and engaging, not just cognitively, but also emotionally with the hugely complex world around them. And all of us have difficulties getting out of bed in the morning sometimes when you think about where are my children going to live? Are they going to have a job? Are they going to have a pension? Are they going to have clean air? Is our city going to be underwater? These really are huge existential challenges. So, but the simple answer is not going to work. Now, populist parties in power usually don't stay there for all that long as democracy remains strong, because they don't deliver. They don't invest in public policy. They tend to become corrupt very fast. We've had a recent example of that. They also tend to go into infighting, and they don't form alliances with other political parties. That's if you read Cas Mudde, for example, fantastic piece in The Guardian last weekend, he spells this out very clearly. And so populism is a passing phenomenon, but it can do an enormous amount of damage, because in order to stay in power, populists tend to immediately start to change the constitution, shut down the media, get other people to buy up the media, and to try to change the rules of the game for democracy, because they know that they aren't actually going to be able to deliver in terms of public policy, which is ultimately what provides the long-term solutions. But to bust that myth, the citizens have to have a really good sense of when they're being sold a crazy deal. And the way to do that in really complex policy issues is to make sure that they actually are involved enough in the issues that they can spot, hey, excuse me, closing the borders is not possible if we want to continue to have trade. Closing the borders is not possible because actually land borders cannot be closed unless you end up with another Iron Curtain. So I think that the gift to a populist is an ill-educated population that is disengaged from politics. So how do you prevent that from happening? By empowering citizens to take the issues into their own hands, both through voting and through deliberative mechanisms. And I really see these things as, these are things that have to happen in the 21st century, because if you rely on voting alone, you're going to have frustrated citizens who will be much more prone to populism. You have to create a resilient citizenry, resilient voters.
Anyone else wants to? Susanna, yep.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more. This is very much what's happened in our country. When I was saying before that addressing that group of citizens and their political representation who would like us to be less peaceful and solve things in a quite opposite way, I was pointing out at the far right of a party with the green logo that I won't name. We have, as you may know, far right in our country. And when you were saying, Heather, that they don't deliver, that was exactly my issue 4 years ago when a leader, Mr. Kotleba, won the regional election. And well, he won the election basically, of course, claiming that he will solve the poverty and he will I think well, he will deal with some social issues in order to stay polite in a way that are beyond description, while besides that, of course, he didn't deliver even to his voters that actually demanded from him this kind of justice. He didn't even have the basic competence to do any kind of to introduce any kind of policies or measures in this regard. He was simply as a president of a region, the president of a region in our country doesn't have the competence to address social issues or to, let's say, have an own army or some kind of armed forces to bring about some kind of action towards a certain group of people. So first of all, he was lacking competence, and he lost in the regional election. But sadly, even so, the numbers, his percents are rising. And recently, a poll came out where it was a research that was basically researching the support, potential support in the European elections among youth, among students of middle schools. And sadly, his party came out the strongest. Let's say the democratic forces that rose based on the events of last year were second, but still he's winning among the most sensitive age group. These are the young people that we rely on. These are the people that we want to build our future for. And regardless of his incompetence of such people, and they're not delivering, their numbers are rising. And among young people whom we're trying to desperately deliver the information and simply convince them that this is not the way, and if not for reasons of belief, then for nothing else, then simply for the practical reason that whatever they want to bring about is not going to happen. But unfortunately, this is the result. So what we're doing in our organization is that we have found out that the young people, they don't want to come, they don't want to be part of educational process which will deliver to them the right information that they should be creating their opinions on. We have assumed the role based on the last year's events. We assumed the role where we started to produce our cultural events always with the strong idea of democracy, especially addressing the young people. And I have to say that the impact is very strong. Every time we organize a festival or that is followed by a line of discussions that is going on for weeks and months, it is completely full. The students are really greatly interested into that. So they like to come into a cultural center. It is much more interesting for them than when they listen to it at school, for example. And it showed itself so far that this is a very good and natural way how to really canalize them this information that we want them to build their opinions on.
Matthew, you had something to say?
I just want to say, let's try to avoid the implication, which is the great thing about deliberation, is that it gives nice progressive liberals like us the solutions that we want. So, the point about deliberation is that citizens will come to the conclusions they come to. So Extinction Rebellion, which is the kind of spontaneous green kind of civil disobedience movement that started in London and spreading, one of its three goals is to have a citizens' assembly, because it thinks, and I think it's right, that if we had a citizens' assembly, citizens would express a preference for the kind of long-term action we need on the climate, yeah, and that would legitimize politicians making some brave choices, which might mean short-term sacrifices. Yet, it's also important to remember that when they had a citizens' assembly in Japan after Fukushima, that the citizens were asked what mattered, and they said, look, in the long run, we want a renewable energy system, but right now we're worried about security of supply, so we'll have more nuclear power stations. So, in these conversations, remember the democratic principle here, which is that citizens will decide what they will decide. And I think, by the way, we are talking primarily here about the state, but I think one of the things that would happen if citizens were more involved is some challenges to elements of capitalism. And I think that then creates issues around the willingness of capital to be responding to respond to those kinds of decisions, and also to elements of globalization. So we have to recognize that, this is not going to be about putting citizens in a room so that they can, I don't know, assert third way policies and we can all go back to where we were 20 years ago. They will come to a whole variety of interesting conclusions that will be challenging to many people. I'll just give you one story just as an example of this, which is I saw, it wasn't really a full citizens jury, but it was a kind of citizen engagement process. This was around pensions. And we were talking to people in the group about the fact that in Britain, if you save for a private pension, you'll typically pay kind of 1.5%, 2% a year of fees. So we said to this group of kind of mainly middle class people, so what do you think the percentage of your savings you will have paid by the time you retire in fees? And they said, well, 1 or 2%. And we said, no, 30%. Because you'll pay that 1 or 2% every year, or, for the money you put in with the first year, you'll pay that 1 or 2% 40 times. And they went completely crazy. They were beside themselves with rage. And had that been a citizens' assembly, those financial institutions would have had to change their practices pretty quickly because there was very little consent for it. So anyway, democracy isn't neat, and it comes up with challenging solutions. And one of the things it may come up with is that people say, we do not want a globalized system where we have no capacity to regulate capital in our country in the way that we want to. And in that extent, Trump is on to something, which is that people might say, we do want a sense of agency, thank you very much. And if democracy is renewed, it's harder for capital to say, well, why should we listen to these politicians? They're discredited, no one likes them. If you renew democracy, it will be more of a challenge to other vested interests.
On what part is Trump, might he be onto something?
He's onto something in the sense that people don't want to be told, your country cannot do this because it's part of a global system, and the way he expresses that is ugly and irrational and ultimately, in my view, it will be counterproductive. But nevertheless, he is reflecting a view that people have, which is that they worry that global institutions lack legitimacy and they still care a lot about the nation state. And there was, let's face it, a kind of liberal complacency about people's willingness to abandon national sovereignty and national interest in favour of internationalism. And that's a lesson we've all had to learn, and we have to kind of adapt to that. It doesn't mean throwing away internationalism, but it means responding to where public concern lies.
Let me just follow up on that, because on two concrete examples on things that Trump really made big headlines on, when he, during the campaign, called out, I think it was car manufacturers, to keep their plants in the US. At first they complied, but within a year, they had to shut down the plants because it just simply did not work. And on his position on tariffs, what is lost in the conversation is that tariffs are paid eventually by the citizens themselves, by the American side, and not by the foreigners. So where is he helping the sovereignty of the American people?
So my point is not that Trump is right. My point is that what Trump is appealing to, which is the sense that nations should have control of some of the big decisions that matter to them. So you're right about those issues, but I ask people whether they think that global corporations should evade tax in their country. And as I say, you can't predict the outcome of this process, but I'm pretty sure people say no, that's not satisfactory to us. And certain other kind of practices. So I think that what I'm saying is people's desire to say we as a country would like to have more control over our destiny and not to be told you can't interfere with that because it's in an international treaty. That's what he's onto, even though his articulation of it is opportunistic and irrational.
Heather, before I give you the floor, I just want to do a point of one. I'm just going to check in with our poll. You do. Well, I'm glad. But basically, to the first question that we asked, do you think that social polarization is a threat to democracy? The majority now, 29 compared to, as opposed to, or versus 26, believe that no, social polarization is not a threat to democracy. So that is a bit of a surprising result. And before I give you the floor, we're going to move on to another question. It's the same process, and this time it's a multiple multiple choice question. The question is, what do you think is missing in our societies to have healthy democracies? Is it A, equality of opportunity, B, the quality of education, C, better use of technology, or D, trust? Heather, I give you the floor.
Well, I was just going to point out that social polarization is not the same thing as political polarization. That, of course, as one of the people has commented on here, you need a certain degree of polarization in a democratic system because it's a contest between alternatives. Voting is about choosing one of a number of platforms. And so a certain degree of polarization is inevitable. The question is how extreme it becomes and whether it leads to, whether political polarization leads to social polarization, where people vote on the basis of identity rather than policy choices. And that is the fundamental difference, I would argue. That's what's damaging for democracy, is when people feel that they should vote for their tribe rather than, and that's, I'm not just talking about the Trump way of doing that, but also the way you see ethnic voting in a lot of countries and so on, rather than voting on the basis of policy choice, because those are very different kinds of democratic choice. But just to come on to the next question of what's missing in societies to have healthy democracies, I think we've actually talked about every one of these areas, including even the technology side. But I think it's very important to look at the quality of these things. I mean, I like the way it says quality education. It's not just more education. The quality of facilitation we were talking about with deliberative processes, the way that whether technology has a beneficial effect on democracy or a detrimental effect depends enormously on what kind of technology and how it's used. Is it used for hacking elections, or is it used for encouraging people to be more involved in democracy? These are very different things, and it depends what kind of technology you're looking at. And the trust element, well, there's a chicken and egg here. You need to have trust to have a healthy democracy. A healthy democracy tends to produce more trust. But what happens once you're into a negative spiral? What happens when you're into a spiral of losing trust, democracy becoming unhealthy because it's becoming dominated by extremely divisive issues, and people are not discussing the issues that are really facing them longer term because it's become very focused on drama and adversarial politics and so on, particularly in the media, as Matthew was saying earlier. So I think the trust issue is very tricky. Trust is something that you cannot simply create out of the air. It's a function of other things. And what I would argue here is that that a healthy democracy is one where people are skeptical, where people are thinking critically about what they see. If they are blindly trusting in what they're told by politicians, by teachers, by the media, that's not going to be a healthy democracy. So I think trust is something that needs to be based on other things. I would argue it's a secondary a factor in all of this rather than a primary factor. You can argue that, you know, a trusting society in one leader, for example, is far from being a healthy democracy. It's a very, very dangerous thing.
Thank you for that. Before I open the floor to the questions and answers, I just want to kind of summarize what we've heard today and then open it up to each one of our panelists to end with perhaps a recommendation, or if not a recommendation, perhaps a story or an example where things are working, a positive note. So just listening to you, it's clear that there is a need to democracy isn't doing well, and there's a need to rethink how we practice it, whether it's finding ways to bring about a bigger sense of community, helping people understand the real consequences of the choices that they want to make, improving the quality of education, giving people the information they need without being paternalistic instead of the sugar information they perhaps crave, augmenting and bolstering democracy as it stands right now, making sure that these democratic activities are always peaceful and constructive and based on trust and cooperation, but also making sure to do the deliberative process properly with the right technique, not just as a band-aid when things aren't going well for the people who are in power, as a way to kind of pacify, as you would put a pacifier in the mouth of a baby. So these are very big issues, and I can't think off the top of my head of one democratic society that is doing all of these things, but I am going to ask each one of you to give either a recommendation or to point to a place where things are going in the right direction. Do you want to go for it, Peter?
Maybe I'll try and answer some of that indirectly. I think to sort of sum up what we've been discussing, for a long time we've been acting as though it's actually fine to have such pitifully low expectations of citizens and the institutions that support them. And what's required is that we all raise our game here. People want to say, but they're also willing to serve. The problem isn't that we've been asking too much of people, it's that we've been asking far too little. What this will require, at least in Canada, is not transforming democracy. This is going to be one meaningful, durable intervention where over the next 10 years we'll work to bring this to scale. And scale in Canada looks like between 60 and 100 of these reference panels or assemblies happening each year. And you think, wow, that sounds like a lot. But you think, well, we've got, 10 subnational provinces. We've got a federal government with 60 some departments. We've got all of the major cities, and each of them have their own departments of social welfare and education and health and the rest. So there's more than enough government, and there are more than enough issues, and there are more than enough citizens to give everyone the chance to participate in this way once or twice in their lifetime. So it's very achievable. But once we've achieved that over the course of the next decade, we're still going to be confronted with a lot of the other challenges that we've been discussing today. And I think that does bring us back to the point I was trying to make around public learning. And that, surveys like this have become so conventional. I think they're a bit of a virus. How many conferences do you go to where you get, I'm sorry, but really inane stuff thrown up on a Twitter follow or a screen like this where why do we care? Why do we, this is kind of empty opinion. Maybe we can have a conversation from it. I'm much more interested in what you know or think you know about things, because when I ask people, often what you'd assume to be kind of common knowledge, people are off by orders of magnitude. So if I'm interested in how people feel about newcomers in Canada and managing our social compact around multiculturalism, sure, I want to know whether people are supportive of our immigration policies or not, but I actually want to know whether they know Canada's population, whether they know how many people are coming each year, whether they can name the top 3 countries of origin, whether they can name what our natural birth rate is, whether they can talk about what the education levels of newcomers are, and whether they can tell me what a newcomer's unemployment rate is in aggregate. And, if people are off by what we might regard as basic information, then having the kind of informal conversation at our dinner tables and our workplaces simply isn't possible, and certainly bringing those conversations into more formal settings of the kinds we've been describing to augment representative democracy will only be more challenging.
So we can do that also quickly so that I can also take questions from the audience, because we have a bunch of them that have come through the app.
I have a quick one. I think Ireland is really interesting. So there was obviously the referendum on Article 8 that I mentioned, but thinking of a recent look at the question of burning peat, which is an age-old tradition in Ireland, and where a citizens panel got together and actually was asked, okay, so what do we do about this? Peat is clearly, it's a carbon sink. It's incredibly important for the climate. It's still being burned in power stations in parts of Ireland. And there are jobs at stake here. And what's really interesting about it was that by making transparent the facts of the case, and particularly where people were off by orders of magnitude, for example, the number of jobs involved was not 700,000, as several people thought, but 700. Full, which means, what's the social protection program you can devise for those 700 people? And this relates also to this whole question about globalization and the capitalist system that Matthew was pointing to, that if you talk to people about, okay, what are you really concerned about with globalization? Is it about tariffs, or actually are you worried about protection for your family, and particularly, from the vagaries of the market, from the ups and downs of international trade? What is it you're really worried about. Let's go down into that rather than simply the headlines. This is really valuable. And so I think the Irish peat example is a really interesting one, whereby once people began to debate what was really at stake, what the peat was really valuable for, which was there was often a misperception that it was useless apart from using as compost or as fuel, but that it actually encouraged very much biodiversity and it was incredibly important for trapping carbon. But also they began to understand, okay, what are the implications of stopping burning peat? What are the alternatives? And were presented with the actual economic facts of the matter. They came to very reasonable and actually rather consensual conclusions. So, you know, if we're talking about trust of missing in our societies, trusting people to use information when it's given to them. And I mean, Peter's point very originally about what people really want is they want engagement which is from time to time and which is intensive. So they're prepared to engage episodically and intensively towards a clear end. You need to provide opportunities not like that, not here's something that I want to do anyway, and now I'm going to have a citizens' assembly tell me that it's fine to do that.
Great. Susanna?
I'd like to come back to the issue of trust. Well, trust, of course, is an immanent part of democracy. Democracy can never exist without trust. Again, an example from our organization. We would have never built what we have built without funds in such a short time if we didn't have almost unconditional trust for each other. So from that example we can spread further, and we really assumed this as our role for our future existence. We realized that we can no longer be only the creative center, but there is much more that we can and that we should bring to our society, such as the program for youth that I was mentioning, but really the overall issue that we want to tackle, and the duty and mission that we feel we must be fulfilling is really the issue of restoration of trust in our country. Trust not only into public bodies, into governmental institutions, in organizations involved in law enforcement, including the courts, which has much to do with trust of the public, but also on a lower scales, for example, between the hospital and the patient, between the school and the student. These are all levels of the society where the trust is not so understood, it's not so automatic. There is work to be done in this regard. Therefore, trust for us is a bond. It is a inner relationship, and it is a value that must be presented in all levels of our society.
Thank you, Susanna. I'm just going to take these next 5 minutes. I know it's ironic that we're doing a panel on reviving democracy, and I'm going to get to all your questions as fast as I can. I did notice that in the questions that you sent in, there was a lot about technology and social media. So I'm going to group those because I can see that none of you think that better use of technology is missing in our societies, but your questions say otherwise. So the questions that have come in have had to do with online abuse. How do you define online abuse compared to online violence? Is intention on social media part and parcel of the business model of social media? Aren't these companies making money based on vitriolic conversations? And are social media networks the dark side of the individual in the 21st century? So any one of you take any one of these questions. Matthew?
Look, social media is incredibly complex, and my experience is that when you talk to young people who use social media most, they have actually a more sophisticated view of it and how they use it than older people who maybe don't live in that world quite so much. But you know, this is a classic example of the kind of question that would be best served by a deliberative process, actually. I think that it's demotic. You know, the idea that politicians are well placed to make judgments about regulating social media, given the average age of politicians, and given the interest they have and the particular experiences they have, because social media is pretty shit if you're a politician, to be honest, you know, so they have a particularly jaundiced view of it. You talk to young people and they say, well, that's what I use to do my homework and my friends, they're very different view of it. So I'd say it's a classic example, by the way, of something that I would say let's engage citizens, maybe a slightly younger group as well, to really, because it goes back to Peter's point. It's a good example of something where it's not just about, where actually you have a personal knowledge. So Peter's given examples of the fact people don't know stuff, and the good thing about deliberation is you get to find out stuff, and then your judgment changes. But actually, there are some things where it's your personal experience that is the evidence, that is the material that you can use. I didn't answer the earlier question, so I would say I would praise Madrid, because Madrid is a city which takes participation and engagement and sees it as a core public service rather than something you just kind of add on. And then I'd say two things. I'd say, first of all, democracy is like a bicycle. If it's not going forward, it falls over. And so, you know, we should have a continuous program of democratic innovation and reform, and we shouldn't be surprised that when we don't focus on that things start to go wrong. And also I'd say democracy, and I'd absolutely echo Susanna's point here, is a muscle. And I think that trust doesn't come abstractly. Trust comes from engagement. You know, it's action that leads to hope, not hope that leads to action. And so the way to get trust is to have a democratic culture in which people feel that at work, in their dealing with public services, in their dealing with government, that there is a dialogue taking place. And that's how you generate. It's through interaction you generate trust. You don't generate it through PR campaigns or even politicians trying to be better people. It's something that emerges. It's a relational element of society, I think.
Did you want to say something?
Only very quickly on the topic of social media, and by extension, a lot of the work that's going on to create democratic online platforms. And, you know, virtually since the earliest days of the internet, there has been a kind of pet theory that if we can just do democracy online, it's going to solve the kind of mass challenge, and, you know, whether it's kind of variations of deliberation or it's some kind of aggregative direct democracy turbocharged by the internet. To me, I think it's a pretty diminished view of democracy, that it's something that we would do only with a line editor, texting one another, posting messages to one another in fora, and kind of voting things up and voting things down. I think the reason it gets so much traction is it's evidence of the extent to which government is really struggling with sustaining any kind of meaningful connection with people. But I see this fundamentally as a bit of a dead end, and one that actually risks replicating so many of the syndromes of the democratic deficiency that exist in our society. And again, it gets back to questions of representation, questions of trust, questions of empathy, and having the opportunity to learn.
Heather, Susanna? No? You don't have to.
Little thing that I forgot to say is that even if we reach a good level of democracy, even if we win all the, let's say, all the battles for all the democratic values that we wish for ourselves, for our countries, there is still one battle that lies before us, and that is the battle against climate change. And taking, I'll borrow the words from a friend of mine, activist, said a few days ago, that if we lose this battle, we'll lose all the others, and irreversibly. Thank you.
Amen to that. And what's striking actually on social media is how little social media activity there is around climate. Now that's beginning to change. And what's interesting is it's beginning to change not because of social media, but because of people out on the streets. So Extinction Rebellion, the youth climate activists here in Paris, certainly in Brussels, in a lot of other cities, they're going out on the streets to make the point rather than just using Instagram. And these are the youngest. I mean, these are the ones who've grown up with a smartphone more or less less surgically implanted in their hands. So that's really interesting that they've done that. And what I find fascinating about the climate movement and social media is the way that they have made it a part of your identity, that you worry about the climate, that you're concerned about the planet, that you have a larger community beyond your family or your school or even your city or your country, or that you have something in common with the whole of the rest of humanity. And what they're saying, the fundamental argument that they're making is this is a matter of intergenerational justice, that by failing to act now, you are damaging what we are going to inherit. And that's a really different thing from the dynamic that was there in Copenhagen and in Paris on climate. And what I think is interesting is, we often complain that social media are atomizing in society, that they make people very individualistic, that they don't interact enough in real life because they're so busy online. But in fact, we're seeing the opposite happening with the climate movement, where it's not online, it's on the streets, and it's all about feeling common humanity and thinking about our common future. And that's, I think, a very hopeful thing.
Well, I'm so glad to be able to end this panel on a hopeful note. Thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you for coming and listening.